Welcome back to part 2 of our Python for Beginners video of average test score, and we're validating our input using if, elif, else, continue, and break statements. And this one we're going to focus more on the break statement to break out of our loop, and we're also going to add a while loop in this part. First of all, thanks for hanging around for part 2. We'll try to wrap this up a little quicker than the first video. Now in the last video we had 2 conditions that we didn't want. We had one where the user entered nothing, and we had another one where the user entered a letter instead of a number. Now before we move on to anything else, we want to enter a condition where the user can stop. And we're going to add an elif, and we're actually going to put it in front of this one. So I'm going to just copy this line here because it has elif in it. And I'm going to put it here and move it back to the margin, lined up with the ifs and the other ones. And what we're going to put here, it's going to be test score, and we're going to say if it equals, and we're just going to make up a keyword so that the user can get out of it, and we'll just say quit. And we're actually going to put this in front of this one. You might say, well, why didn't you put this after? Because it's not a digit, we didn't want it to bring up this kind of error first. So we want to take care of this one first so that it verifies that quit is going to do something else, because quit is not going to say enter a valid number, and it's also not going to continue. If you remember what happened last time, continue means it goes back to the beginning. Well, break does the opposite. We're going to use something called break, and break just breaks it so it does not continue anymore. It just stops it. So we're going to go here and we'll put 2 things. We'll put a statement just so we know that it's over. And we'll just say grade entry stop, so that it's just an indication that we wanted it to stop. So we're first going to print that, and then we're going to do a break. And what break does is it breaks out of the loop, whereas continue goes back to the beginning, break will stop it, and then move on to the next line of code that it finds outside the loop. And it won't go to the else. It'll just break out of this entire loop that's here. It'll break out of this whole loop. And it won't do any math, it won't do anything that's inside here. So let's just get this to work first before we move on to anything else. So I'm going to test it out. And we'll enter one score. We'll put in a 9 out of 10. And then when we get an enter test score 2, I'm going to put quit. And hit enter. And it says grade entry stopped. And it said average grade of one test is 90%. So that actually worked. Now what happened here is it did figure out the math for the first entry, because the first time we did go through and we actually went to here and we put a number through. So it did all this math the first time and it figured out one score. But then when it came to here and we entered quit, it broke the loop, but it still went, it skipped over this stuff, but it still actually calculated this stuff. And it still did all of this stuff because this is outside the loop. All of these things are still outside the loop. So it still was able to print out this stuff even after the fact. That's why down here when we said quit, grade entry stopped, it still actually printed out these things. Now before we start editing all our other code, and we could certainly do if-else statements for the possible points as well, one thing I'd like to introduce is a while loop. We had a for loop which put it in a specified range of a number. That's pretty much the way a for loop works. It iterates through a certain amount, usually a set amount, but a while loop usually will go as long as a certain condition is true. And it could be a number is less than something, it could be counting. And what we're going to do is just do something real simple. We're going to say while true. And basically true's always true. So while everything is true, this will just keep going. This is what's called an infinite loop. And usually that's not a good thing because it can crash your computer if it can't stop it. But we have elements in place to stop it. We have a break in place. So otherwise, the only thing that would keep going on is you'd keep entering invalid numbers, but you can hit quit at any point to break out of this loop. So we have something already built in. Now break will work with a for loop and a while loop. So we're going to break out of our while loop, and that means we can do this as many times as we want. So if we put an invalid number in 10 times, we can do that, and we could still put as many grades in or as little grades as we want. So first of all, let's just see if this works before we do anything else. And I'm not even going to break it. I'm just going to make sure we can enter some grades. And let's try and do that first. So I'll do 9 out of 10. I'll do 8 out of 10. 7 out of 10. 6 out of 10. And let's try another one. I'll do a 5 out of 10. And I'll hit enter. and it keeps going. Now if I say quit, it says average grade of 5 tests is 70%. Letter grade earned is C. Now it's a little confusing because it says enter test 6 score and we're saying quit there. So we could possibly change the input when we want to quit. But for now, that's stopping things for us. We entered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 grades, and then at grade 6 we hit quit and it stopped, and it still figured out our grade of 5 tests is 70% and we got a C. So that's actually working. So the while loop is working. We were able to break out of it. Now, one other thing we might want to do here is just update our possible points. Now, we still have this as an integer. Now, we could still run into the same scenario where you don't put anything in for possible points, you don't put in a number, all that kind of stuff. All these same conditions could apply to possible points. So we could copy this whole thing here and put it in for possible points, and let's try that out. I'll copy this whole thing, and I'll put it after the input of possible points. And I'll make sure I take this int out as well, because we'll convert it to an int after the fact, just like I did with the test score. Now, we have all these variables named test score, and instead of changing them one at a time, what you could do, one of the things you could do, there's other shortcuts. I don't remember all the shortcuts, but one of the things you could do, I'm on a Mac. If you double click on test score and hold option, you could double click here, double click here, double click here, in any place where there's test score. Now I don't want to go down here because this is figuring out the total, but any of these places where test score should be possible points, I could highlight them. And I forget on Windows, it might be the control key. I'll have to double check that. But for now, it's option double clicking on a Mac, and then you could just type right over it, and I'll just say pos points. So I now changed all those variables, pos points, without having to do one at a time. So that helped. So in between our if else for test score, now we're doing pos points, and then we're doing the validation for that. And we could still quit at any time. We still have to make sure it's a digit. I think all these things would still apply to pos points. So let's just see if this works, because after this is all done, it should still do the math, and it should still break out of the loop and still do these things if possible. So let's just make sure this works. And I'll just do a 9 out of 10 again, and an 8 out of 10. And this time I'll do an 8, and I'll put a J and see what happens. And it looks like it makes me do the whole thing over again. So now if I put in 8 out of 10, it keeps going. So it looks like, and again, I didn't go through all this and double check everything, but it looks like it's not telling me to enter, it's not restarting the test score again, it's restarting the loop. So keep in mind what's happening here when it's going continue, it's going back up to the beginning and doing that input again. So it's telling me to do test 3 all over again. Now that's okay, because you could put a while loop inside a while loop. We could put separate while loops for the test score and a separate while loop for the possible points, but right now they are all part of the same loop. That's why when I entered J in there, it actually continued and went back up. It didn't go back here. It didn't go to the if for possible points. It didn't go to this input. It went all the way back up to this input because that's the input at the start of the loop. And that's okay. This is Python for beginners, so we're not going to deal with every little scenario right now. That's okay that it works that way. That's fine now, but you could always tweak it and decide you want something a little bit different. Now here I'm going to say test score 4 and I'll say quit. Actually, let me put in an 8 and then let me see if quit works. And it does. It says average grade of 3 test score. So it didn't take anything here. It didn't take a test score 4. It gave me an 83%. It gave me a B, and it ended our program. So that worked. So you can certainly test this for different things and tweak it, but considering we're just starting out with some loops and counters and conditionals, this is pretty good. Now, just to review this a little bit, one thing to keep in mind, we're not using a function, and eventually we're going to use functions because we're kind of doing everything outside of functions, which isn't the best way to do things. All this repetitive stuff is really going to be best when we do things in functions. But for now, just so we understand how loops work, the functions will make things even more efficient when we start using them. But we have counters, and our counters don't really kind of kick in until down here, till all this validation is over. So this stuff is all just validation. This stuff is just validation to make sure you put in the right thing. It's just like when you fill out a form on the web and you have to put in an email and a password and all that. We're just validating all that stuff. So it's a lot of work, but it's to get it right so that you don't get errors and things like that. Now, same thing here. It's all validation. Now, this is where the actual math takes place, and we already had that done. And here's more calculations here, and we're getting a grade from this. So I think we'll stop here with part 2 of our average test score, our validation videos, and we'll move on from here.